All right. Hey guys, welcome back for our second session. We have Matthew Spoke, who is the founder and CEO of Open Application Network and Moves. He's going to talk about open apps and how they came into picture and the unintended consequences that the platform economy has been creating. So over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Manaf. It's great to be here. Yeah, well, for one, I'll start by introducing myself, and then I'll start to share my slides just so that everybody can sort of follow along. But as Manav said, my name's Matthew Spoke. I'm calling in from Toronto in Canada. I think after me, you're going to be hearing from one of my colleagues, Ian Chan, as well. Super excited to be here. It was really informative to hear Akshay's presentation this morning as well to understand what's going on in the Indian blockchain landscape. I'm going to talk to you today about not only our business and some of the thesis that we've been working on for the last couple of years. I'll give you the background because I think a lot of what Akshay talked about touches on some of the experience that I've had. I've been working in this space for about 6 years. So I've seen a lot of the ebbs and flows of what's happened in the blockchain industry over that time. But let me share my screen and then we'll get started. Okay. Let's see, is it sharing? Yeah, okay, awesome. I see a thumbs up. That's great. All right, so a little bit of my background, as I said, before starting the Open Application Network and before starting Moves more recently than that, I started in the enterprise space. I think probably where a lot of people come from in the blockchain initially is trying to understand, these applications in the context of large companies. I know that over the last number of years, this has been a big topic in India. I've in fact been involved in a few projects in India over the course of the years. That led me into starting a business in 2016 that was very enterprise focused on the Ethereum protocol, focused on building what we called at the time the Enterprise Ethereum Stack. Eventually became an organization called the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which is still very much active and alive today, an organization that we're still involved with alongside folks like Consensus and JP Morgan and Microsoft and others. So there's definitely been a lot of movement there. But I think over the years, as we developed a stronger conviction for what the technology could do, what became more and more interesting to us was understanding outside of the world of traditional enterprise, what were the new economic dynamics developing online, independent of blockchain networks, but what were these new online economies and what were they leading to, both in terms of positives and negatives? We call these economies platform economies. So you're going to hear me talk today about what were the unintended consequences of some of these platform economies. And I think this is a massive topic in North America and definitely around the world. Where every day now we feel the impact of platform economies in our day-to-day lives. And when I say platform economies, I'm sure you can think about who I'm talking about in terms of companies. It's companies like Apple, through whom many of us get our music. It's companies like Airbnb or Oyo in India, for that matter. Companies like Upwork and Guru, YouTube, and these are companies now that on a daily basis, for most people that have access to a smartphone or a computer, this is how they either consume information, they do their work, they earn their money, they consume services and products. And broadly speaking, this has led to like an entire new economy over the course of the last decade. And I'm not going to suggest that that's a bad thing. I think we can all agree that our lives are a lot more interesting today because of some of these platforms, because of some of these companies. But what I think is often overlooked is the flip side. What have been the unintended consequences of these platforms coming to market? And now, every once in a while, you hear a news story about pressure being put against, let's say, Facebook being pulled in front of the American Congress to get challenged on some of the ways that it operates its business, or Apple for that matter, or Amazon. And even more recently in North America, we're hearing a lot more about the challenges being faced by Uber and Lyft and TaskRabbit and companies like that. And they all sort of speak to a very, very similar underlying problem, that these companies have effectively become little monopolies in their own domains, right? And I say little, they're actually massive monopolies in their own domains. They've created new economies that didn't exist before they showed up. And then they've sort of gone on to dominate and write the rules of those economies. And for the most part, I think that's fair for a new entrant to say, hey, I'm going to create a space that's never been created before, and I'm going to be the one to design the rules of that space. But eventually, that economy becomes a very, very impactful part of people's lives. And it means that we start relying on it as consumers. What I'm going to talk more about as we get later into the presentation is how many people have started relying on these economies as laborers, as workers, right, as a source of income. And as much as there is good in the platforms that I'm talking about today, there has also been unintended side effects. And I truly mean unintended, because I don't think anything that I say today is not intended to suggest that Uber is a bad company or that Shopify has ill intent. I think these companies set out to create some good in the world, to create new economic opportunity, and they have. But in the process of their growth and their scale, they've also created new side effects that we need to stop and think about. And actually, a design space that I'm confident is the perfect place for blockchain technology, and specifically the perfect place that we're starting to focus our attention as the Open Application Network. This is, if you're familiar with our project or our history, we're a public blockchain protocol. We have a cryptocurrency called Aeon that's been in market for about 3 years. That powers this protocol. And then on top of this protocol, we're starting to design and develop things that we call open applications. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what open applications are in the context of these platform companies. But probably one thing to note about the companies that I have up on screen today is that it's not just startups, right? It's not just tech companies that have gone down this path. Now it's every company in the world or every major service provider in the world that sees themselves becoming a platform. They see themselves sort of reconfiguring their business to become a platform. My favorite example is Disney, right? So you can everybody's favorite childhood movie, Walt Disney's, and now Disney Plus, right? Disney Plus is the new Disney platform, and this is true in hundreds and hundreds of companies around the world. They're starting to shift from the way they used to do business to the way they currently do business. And the way they currently do business is now relying very much on the thesis of a platform. And I think for all intents and purposes, this is powered by advances in technology. It's powered by a consumer audience that wants things on demand, in real time, online, and it's forcing companies to re-envision how they ship products and services. But within these platform economies, there's a tension that's been developing. And I'll walk you through, as an example, if I go back to some of these logos, I'll give you an example of Shopify is a hometown favorite, because if you're familiar with Shopify is a Canadian success story. In fact, their office is across the street from our office in Toronto. And Shopify has been, I think, one of the most exciting tech companies to watch over the last 5 years. But let's analyze Shopify from the perspective of the platform problems that I'm talking about. If you think of Shopify at a very high level, there are effectively 4 stakeholders in the Shopify ecosystem. There is Shopify, the business. There is the merchants that start stores on top of Shopify. There is the consumers that purchase from those merchant stores. And then there is the third-party advertisers, app developers, plug-in developers that are providing value into the Shopify ecosystem. For all intents and purposes, this economic structure works really well. Merchants are able to build and launch stores very affordably. Consumers are able to find products and purchase them very conveniently, and advertisers are able to get in there and sort of add value to the economic transactions that are happening. But what's true in the case of Shopify is that Shopify has built its entire business model with the interest of the merchant in mind. So everything they do is to the benefit of the merchant. They call it arm the rebels, right? So when Shopify passes a policy in favor of the merchant, often what happens is that policy could be favorable to one stakeholder, but unfavorable to another. A good example a few years ago is when Shopify banned MailChimp from its ecosystem. Simple reasons. Shopify thought it could build a better product than MailChimp to do mass distribution, mass mailings to consumers. There was a little bit of an anti-competitive threat where Shopify didn't necessarily want MailChimp in the ecosystem because they could start stealing value from what Shopify was providing to its merchants. But they framed that as a positive change or a positive policy that was being passed for the sake of the merchant, obviously in its own self-interest as well. I think my argument would be that maybe MailChimp deserved to be in the Shopify ecosystem. And if it was a more open and dynamic economic market, MailChimp would be in there competing alongside Shopify. And I think these are the examples when I say monopolistic power that exists in the hands of companies like Shopify, not that they're ill-intended, but they have the ability to pass these types of rules without thinking about the consequences of how this impacts It's stakeholders. More near and dear to my heart, an area that we're now spending a lot of our time is in the gig economy. And the gig economy, and I'll touch on this a little bit more in a few minutes. The other side of the equation is not only consumers and companies like Uber, but it is workers, right? People putting their time on the platforms like Uber, putting their time on the platforms like Guru and Upwork, and there's thousands and thousands of these platforms. And often what happens in those equations, and is becoming very much a topical pain point in the media today, is that Uber will do everything it can to reduce its fees for customers at the expense of its drivers not making enough money to earn a living, for example. So there's these economic tensions that are starting to pop up. We've narrowed down these tensions to effectively three major pain points that we call sort of the platform problem. One is the concept of ownership. Who owns the economic activity happening within these platform economies? The second is the idea of stakeholder alignment. How can you improve stakeholder alignment between various groups that are on opposite ends of these economic transactions? And the third is the concept of common goods and services. If it's not in anybody's economic best interest, there are things that go unbuilt, undeveloped. And this is an area particularly that we're starting to focus a lot on in this third bucket of common goods and services, but also quite a bit in the other two. And that's where open apps come in. From our perspective, open apps are different than decentralized apps. They're different than what you might hear about in the blockchain industry, because we view open apps as being additive and complementary to existing online economies. So we don't see ourselves, pushing to compete with Uber getting out of the market. We see ourselves benefiting from the fact that Uber has an existing established network effect of millions and millions of people around the world consuming its service and working on its service. And all we can potentially do with an open application is add value and rebalance the economic relationships that exist within an ecosystem like Uber. And so open apps have a couple of characteristics that make that really feasible and interesting and plausible, and create a design space for us to build new businesses. So what are open apps? I mean, you know this because you're familiar with the blockchain space. So I'm not, I'm preaching to the choir here, but open apps are by definition unowned. They don't belong to the primary company in a particular economy. Let's say Airbnb or Uber. They're shared. They're a shared resource by everybody in that ecosystem. They're globally accessible, so nobody could censor somebody in or out of an open app. They're secure and they're always online. These characteristics of blockchains also provide us a really interesting tool set to solve problems in these economies in a very unique way. Open apps are only possible on public blockchains. This is probably an area of tension, especially in countries like India, where there's been a lot of legislative pressure and government policies that have been pushing back on the idea of cryptocurrencies and public blockchains. And a lot of people saying, well, the enterprise blockchain space is just as exciting and just as interesting. Well, frankly, it's not true. And frankly, to solve problems at the scale we're talking about, to solve global problems, online economic problems, you need a system that is global, and you need a system that has economic characteristics. Private blockchains are by definition not global, and by definition don't have the same economic characteristics as public blockchains. So if you want to be able to solve problems at the scale of Uber, at the scale of Airbnb, at the scale of Shopify, you need to be able to solve those problems on top of public blockchains. This is the path we went down about a year and a half ago. We announced to the world that we were starting to pivot our focus towards what we called the Open Application Network. Explaining how Aeon, our cryptocurrency, sort of economically fuels this thesis. And then more recently, over the course since the beginning of 2020, we've been working on our own business called Moves, a business that I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into in terms of how we're building an open application to solve problems in the gig economy. And specifically, when I say the gig economy, I mean problems being faced by independent workers that find their entire livelihoods by doing services through online marketplaces. And so, I use the examples near and dear to me that are in my backyard, which would be companies like Uber and DoorDash and Upwork and TaskRabbit. And there are equivalents around the world, ways for me to do micro gigs, way for me to earn micro incomes, and way for me to start pulling together an income stream that is very different than traditional people income streams with jobs and employment, right? So, and that's led to some characteristics that sort of compelled us to build this new business that we've been working on for the last 8 months or so. So Moves is solving the unintended consequences of the gig economy, a very specific but large subset of the platform economy. By independent workers, when we talk about our target audience, we're looking for two characteristics. We're looking for, does this person make their time as labor available through an online marketplace? And does that marketplace connect supply and demand effectively? So very, very simply, every gig economy platform you can think of. What this doesn't capture is platforms, let's say like Airbnb or Oyo, which are more like an asset-based marketplace where I'm putting my asset online, like my home or my apartment or whatever, and I'm allowing somebody to rent it. It's not me selling my time. The reason we're so focused on the independent worker is because of the gaps that we see that exist. And if I jump back to some of the gaps in the platform problem space, this will sound really familiar to you when you start thinking about the gig worker or the independent worker through this lens. Ownership. Who owns the economic transaction between an Uber driver and an Uber passenger? Is it Uber that owns that transaction? Is it the driver that owns that transaction? I think there's probably space for us to rebalance that equation. Stakeholder alignment. Why do Uber drivers feel compelled to protest and go and march in the streets to fight back against Uber? Because they don't feel like they're aligned to the company that's providing them the opportunity to work. And common goods and services. Who is looking out for the best interests of this worker? Do they have the ability to pay for health insurance? Do they have the ability to save for retirement? There are things that are just going unaddressed for an entire new workforce that is growing around the world. And in North America, and I suspect this is quite true in other parts of the world as well, this part of the labor market is exploding. We estimate that in North America, this is at least 20% of the adult workforce earns a portion of their income in the gig economy. Some of the estimates take us as high as 35% of the adult workforce. So if you can think about that in the context of any country, India in particular, I suspect probably has numbers similar, if not greater than what I'm talking about. This is tens of millions, in some cases, hundreds of millions of people that are now earning their primary source of income outside of the traditional constructs of a job. And nobody's ready for this. Governments aren't ready for this. Policy is not ready for this. Banks aren't ready for this. And all of a sudden, these people are here. They've been here for the last 5 years. They're going to grow in numbers, and our economic system is not designed to capture them. So this became this perfect blank canvas for us to say, let's go build a business that solves the unintended consequences of independent workers in the gig economy. How do we do that? We do that by focusing on three things. What does it look like to build for you a portable reputation, both financial and a qualitative reputation? So if you think of the way that you are recognized for your work in the gig economy, it is through earning money and earning reviews or ratings, right? So you earn stars or reviews by customers and you get paid, right? So what is it about that is broken today? Well, it's all isolated today. The reviews I earn on Uber are not portable to Lyft. The reviews I earn on Upwork do not allow me to get a job in the future if I want to move back into the workforce, right? So all of these things are siloed and isolated within different platform economy systems, depending on the platform that you're working on. The second part that we're really excited about is the idea of portable benefits funds, the idea that independent workers should be able to put money aside, or in some cases have contributed money from the platforms they work on and hold them as portable benefits funds. So that if I work part of my life for Uber and then I decide to go work part of my life for Lyft, I can effectively sum up that money, start to save for retirement, start to save for health insurance, start to save for things that are just necessary for me to have like the basic standard of living that I expect, depending on which country I'm in and what the norms are, to make me at least on the same playing field as my peer who has a job. How do I make sure that I'm not at a disadvantage versus my peer? And finally, how does this all tie into the broader concept of open finance or what the crypto market likes to call DeFi? And so our business is sort of focused in on this area. Let me switch slides. Sorry. You can learn more about what we're building at Moves, but I'm going to give you a little bit more of insight into how the product is evolving today. And in fact, this is something that we haven't quite announced to the rest of the world yet. We're going to be doing over the course of the next few weeks. But we're building kind of two core concepts in the Moves product that are going to tie us to the Open Application Network. So one is the concept of building, solving financial pain points for our customers. This is pretty traditional fintech stuff, right? This is how do I build better payment products, better lending products, better bank account products, so that independent workers feel like they have products that speak to their needs. The needs that we're finding today is that independent workers often go completely unsupported. They go completely they're sort of off on their own, having to fend for themselves when they encounter an unexpected expense, when they encounter an unexpected hurdle in life. It's very difficult for people in this economy to go and rely on a bank because they don't have the characteristics that banks look for. They don't have stability of income. They don't have pay slips. They don't have things like that. So the first thing that we're building into Moves is the idea that I can view your income regardless of source. I can allow you to plug in your various gig profiles. Let's say you work on Uber and you work on TaskRabbit. I can allow you to sync those two profiles to your Moves profile. I can now see a summary view of the money you make on different profiles. And I can now use that to, let's say, adjudicate you for a line of credit or give you access to a savings product because I now see the totality of your income, regardless of how many gigs you do. And that could be one source of gigs. It could be 6 sources of gigs. It doesn't matter. We can plug them all in to a singular profile. What that also allows us to do is pull all reputational and qualitative data out of those profiles. So I can start to do things like summarize the average star rating that you're earning both on Uber and on Lyft. And I can give you that star rating back so that you can carry it with you to your next gig. And that becomes a part of your Moves profile that makes it more portable. These are concepts that are going to be more and more embedded in terms of how we're using the public blockchain to actually enable this. Finally, within the product, you'll be able to consume financial products. You'll be able to apply for a loan. You'll be able to save money towards goals. You'll be able to get your wages daily instead of having to wait weekly or bi-weekly. These things that are small but important pain points to solve for members of the gig economy. The other side of the thesis that we're developing is this concept of ownership. And again, if I jump back to probably one of the biggest pain points that really got us excited about this space is when you look at platform problems, it's this first bucket of ownership. It's the idea that within an ecosystem of various stakeholders, there is nothing that, and really ownership and stakeholder alignment are sort of two sides of the same coin. There is nothing that drives incentives better than feeling like you're on the same team as the people that you're working alongside. And so in our context, that means how do we create a system of ownership where everybody in that ecosystem, in any particular ecosystem, let's use the gig economy as an example for Moves, feels compelled to the success of the ecosystem, earns economic value in the ecosystem, and feels like they're on the same team as the other person. So in this case, what we're building in the Moves is a concept we're calling the Moves Collective. The Moves Collective, for lack of a better analogy, you can think of as sort of a digital cooperative. So as a worker in the gig economy, I can become a member of the Moves Collective. As a company in the gig economy, I can become a member of the Moves Collective. As a capital provider to workers in the gig economy, I can become a member of the Moves Collective. And what does that mean? That means that you're now a member of an economic system that's powered on top of the OAN, powered by the blockchain, that gives everybody a shared interest in the value of its asset. And so you can earn this asset for doing positive things. Let's say you're a capital provider. We're building a loans marketplace right now where DeFi participants can lend money so that we can actually take that money and lend it to an independent worker that happens to work for Uber or happens to work for TaskRabbit. Both sides of that transaction can now earn economic interest in the Moves Cooperative. They're earning that through Aon. They're earning that in the underlying asset of the OAN. A Moves member who is a customer or a user can refer a friend and earn some Aon. They can use Aon to repay their loan. They can do things within the product that sort of give them a complementary asset effectively, on top of the fact that they need dollars going in and out of their bank accounts for their day-to-day expenses like paying for rent and paying for food. They're also starting to develop in parallel a portfolio of this new asset class that is their membership stake in the underlying collective. And so that concept is something that's very, very near and dear to our thesis that we're going to be publishing a lot more about in the next couple of weeks. But something that we're very excited about. So between access to financial products and sort of redesigning how a financial technology company like ourselves interacts with our customers, in this case, we're repositioning ourselves to be a member-based organization rather than just a customer-based organization. And that ensures that over time, our members benefit as we benefit, and our partners benefit as we benefit, and more importantly, our members benefit from each other. That Uber should start to feel economically aligned to its drivers and vice versa is an important thing to be working towards. Not only because it's a healthier way to build the gig economy, but frankly, I think it's the only way for the gig economy to survive long term. I think without completely redesigning the underlying economic system of the gig economy, it potentially fails over the long term. And we're starting to see a lot of that pressure being pushed by governments and regulators and legislators around the world, Uber just last week almost pulled out of California because of rules like this, right? So we're now injecting ourselves in this discussion, and we actually think it's the perfect moment for us to showcase to the world a very real application of how the blockchain can be used in a way that impacts regular people in their day-to-day lives, where they don't have to be crypto experts. And I think that's a big difference between what you'll hear from us and what you'll hear from a lot of other people in the crypto industry. Is our target audience is not familiar with crypto. Our target audience has never held a private key before. Our target audience is that person who makes their income driving on Uber, that could have a better life, and hopefully our designs will help us get them there. So if you want to learn more about the Open Application Network or Moves, obviously, follow us. I'm going to be sticking around for a chunk of the day to meet with some of you and talk to you. So come ask questions if you have any. And by all means, if you have any questions right now, I have a few minutes. So Manav, I'll let you jump back in.
Thank you, Matt. Any questions for Matt you have here? Okay, we have one question here. Okay, so the question is, can you update about the progress on Aeon interoperability?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question. Yeah, and this is something that we were working on a few years ago. For those of you who've been familiar with the project and following us over the last few years, and actually something that's come back up as being quite relevant to a lot of our designs right now. So a few years ago, we built a system. We were the first protocol to build a bridging system that effectively could connect the movement of an asset between two blockchains. In this case, the Aeon blockchain and the Ethereum blockchain is something that we did back in 2018. And we published that design, and we put a lot of research into the way that mechanism would work. And actually kind of very near front and center in our current design. And I haven't given you a full breakdown of what our new product is going to look like, but we're building a product that is effectively a Moves capital market product where lenders can participate in a lending market that actually provides capital for us to pass on to a gig worker. And so that market dynamic is something that is still being worked out, but we intend to release the first version of that over the course of the next probably month to 6 weeks. Within that design, the reason I bring that up is that we're actually starting to collect assets that sit on top of the Ethereum network. And so once again, we're back into the design space of interoperability, not in and of itself because it's an interesting research topic or because it's an interesting technical problem to solve, but because our product and our business actually requires it. So you'll hear more about this product over the course of the next few weeks. But very, very simply speaking, there's going to be sort of a three-sided market that we're enabling to allow us access to money as a borrower. And I use us as a proxy to our worker, but we'll be borrowing money. And then on the other side of the market will be lenders and guarantors that'll be able to participate using assets like USDT, but also guarantee loans with Aeon. And so when we're taking assets that sit on top of another blockchain, it requires that we have smart contracts on two systems that can communicate with each other. In this case, smart contracts on the OAN and smart contracts on Ethereum that need to communicate with each other so that the logic of that transaction can actually be translated between networks. So there is some relevance to interoperability within our current product designs. And so, more to come on that as we get ready to launch some of those.
Perfect. Thank you, Matthew. Any other questions you have for Matt? All right. There's another question. This is from Abhay. Can we use the Open Application Network in telecom network architecture like in 5G core, as the 5G core is being moved to REST API over HTTP/2 and HTTPS/3? Does that question?
Well, you're going to lose me a little bit on that question because I'll admit front and center that I'm not an engineer, but I'll tell you that theoretically, without getting into the specific specs of HTTP2 or HTTP3, theoretically, I think the combination of like 5G being rolled out around the world and blockchain applications is like a really, really interesting overlap. I think there's a lot of opportunity because now it allows us to build more dynamic and real-time applications that don't necessarily need to flow through the App Store experience. And the reason I feel so strongly about that is because the App Store experience, if you're familiar with how Apple monetizes or Google monetizes, is a very expensive tax on how we might interact with each other through an app, right? You use an app to buy a service from me, 30% of that transaction might be going to Apple. I think what's exciting about 5G from my perspective is we can build equally compelling user experiences that don't go through the App Store, that go through sort of the browser, but still have the characteristic of like real-time delivery of content, real-time delivery of services. I think that's going to be pretty important for any strategy like ours moving forward. If I'm a gig worker, for example, and I'm starting to manage my profile, and I'm paying for access to my profile, for example, that access might be happening through a digital asset like Aon. It might not be happening through a credit card rail, and it might be happening directly through a web-based application instead of through a mobile-based application. I think that becomes a lot easier to design for in a world where 5G is sort of the norm. But I can't say that necessarily answered your question, but that's probably where I'll leave that.
Right, thank you. We have another question for you. So how is interoperability going to help insurance companies?
That's a good question. It depends on what they're trying to insure. I mean, I think that's a very broad question, so I can only speculate on where you're coming from. But I'll give you an example in our case, and this is really not insurance companies. But it is a concept of insurance that is something we're working on, and that's the idea of guarantees or guarantors in a financial transaction between a lender and a borrower. So it's a form of insurance. So let me walk you through a very hypothetical design right now, and hypothetical. It's actually being built, but let's say you are an Aon holder that wants to participate in a lending transaction that is between us and a USDT holder, right? So Moves is borrowing effectively dollars from a USDT holder. The USDT holder wants guarantees on the repayment of those dollars. There's no collateral in that equation between us and them. And so what we're building is effectively a mechanism of insurance or guarantees where in a separate contract, using Aon, a community member could come in and guarantee a portion of the loan. And they could come in and deposit Aon into this guarantee contract. Effectively, that pays them back a rate for providing that guarantee because it de-risks the transactions for the lender. But what happens is that if the lender ends up in a state of default, they want to have claims over that guarantee pool, right? So they want to be able to draw the guarantee if the loan defaults. So in this case, the loan is sitting on Ethereum, but the guarantee is sitting on the OAN. Right, so interoperability is the mechanism by which, as an address interacting with that USDT contract on Ethereum, I need to be able to claim my guarantee collateral from the contract sitting on the OAN. So a message and a relay needs to exist between those two networks. That's a very simple example of insurance that we're actually building right now, but in the context of loans specifically.
All right, I think so. This is the last question. What are your thoughts on open application for the social media platforms like YouTube, Instagram, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, we actually did a lot of research in this space before we decided to build Moves. We were looking at various verticals in the platform economy, and one area that really fascinated us was really YouTubers. But I think the dynamic is quite similar with Instagram influencers. But the new sort of economic persona that exists over the last few years of like the online social media influencer that earns their living through a subscription or through a group of subscribers on platforms like YouTube is a really interesting dynamic. What's challenging about that dynamic is the fact that they're solely dependent on YouTube, right? So YouTube controls their subscribers. YouTube controls the way they get paid. YouTube controls what type of content they're allowed to publish or not allowed to publish. And in some cases, YouTube's algorithms actually direct higher grossing advertising to certain content and diminishes the advertising going to other content, which can impact the amount of wages that a YouTuber earns. And it's quite similar on Instagram. So there are companies that have started to pop up to try to address that. Companies like Patreon that now allow let's say a viewer to subscribe directly to a YouTuber on Patreon, not through YouTube. And that allows for an income stream that is separate from YouTube. I think the dynamics are quite similar to what I described in the gig economy. I think there is opportunity to build businesses in that space that would allow, let's say, a YouTuber to own the relationship and the data about their subscribers and not be reliant on YouTube for that. Let's say a YouTuber to have a separate stream of revenue that can come through outside sources than YouTube directly. And I think even really more interesting is if you can imagine a dynamic where the YouTuber could provide value back to its viewers through some form of asset. So back to this concept of like getting on the same asset with your customer. If I could say, hey, if you're a loyal follower of mine, or if you reshare my content, or if you're an active commenter, or whatever, you become an advocate of my channel, I want you to earn my asset. My asset might be, Matt's channel on YouTube has its own little micro asset, and I can give it away to my most loyal followers. And all of a sudden, if that asset turns into anything of substance, potentially I give you voting rights. Hey, what do you want my next YouTube video to be about? People with my asset can vote on my content, things like that. So I think there is actually a really interesting design space for influencers that is definitely open for somebody to start building, and the Open Application Network would be a great place for that.
All right. Thank you, Matt, for answering all the questions and sharing your knowledge. Thank you, guys. If there are any other questions for him, we can all discuss it during the networking session, and let's move on to the next session. But I think so. There's one last question we can take. Are you focusing on both DeFi and interoperability, or can they work together?
Well, I'll reframe. We're focusing on solving a consumer problem. We're not focusing on solving a technology problem. The best way I can answer this, and this is the big shift in my mindset of the last few years, is too many blockchain companies are focused on a technology problem. Not enough of them are focused on a consumer problem. Our consumer problem is, how do we create a better, more fair gig economy for independent workers? Within that consumer problem, there are technical problems to solve. Some of those technical problems will include DeFi, they'll include interoperability, they'll include other mechanisms. But I'd say if you were to really, really try to label our business as a focus, it is solve the problem of independent workers in the gig economy, build open applications so that they can actually drive value for a massive demographic. What is needed in the back end is stuff that we'll discover along the way. I mean, in the short term, the short answer is yes. We are using concepts of DeFi, we are using concepts of interoperability, but because they help us solve a consumer problem, not because they're interesting in their own right.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, guys. Now we'll
talk to you soon.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.